Here to clear the way is retired Colonel Jack Jacobs, who is our MSNBC military analyst, Barbara Vandelin, a clinical psychologist, founder and president of Give an Hour, a national nonprofit which provides free mental health services to our service members and families. And in Washington, Jon Soltz, an Iraq war veteran who is now the chairman of VoteVets.org. Thank you all three for being here. This story has obviously gripped America this week and much of the world. I want to start. I want to start with you, Colonel, and ask, when you heard this story based out of your very long experience, what were your first ideas about what had likely occurred?
The first thing that popped into my mind is that the chain of command had failed. You have a large number of people living in close quarters for a long period of time. They see each other every day, all day, day after day. They're almost never apart. And yet somebody managed to do something which came as a tremendous surprise. The first thing that comes to my mind is that this staff sergeant who worked for a sergeant first class, who worked for a lieutenant, worked for a captain, all of whom lived together, it should have been determined that he had a problem. And my guess is that the investigation will disclose, in fact, people in the chain of command did know that he had a problem. All
right, Jon Soltz, I want to go to you on a very similar question here. We have a statement that came out yesterday, and it is too early to determine what factors may have played into this incident, and the defense team looks forward to reviewing the evidence. This is from Staff Sergeant Roberts' defense team, lawyer here. Let me ask you this. When you heard this, and now that we've seen some of these statements, are you in agreement with the colonel that this is likely what happened, or are you, in your contact with vets regularly, thinking that something else may have occurred?
Well, personally, I was sort of devastated by it. I remember I was looking at my BlackBerry. I was waking up in the morning, and I saw the story, and it hurts. You feel for the families. You feel for the soldier. You feel for the unit. You feel for the mission, because this is negative on so many levels that we can talk about. And so I think anytime you have the situation, it hurts. It hurts, someone who served proudly in the Army in Iraq twice and in Kosovo, it's the brand. In regards to the statements coming out of his lawyers, I don't think we know. I've talked to some people on background that sort of are close to the investigation that I know who are still in the service, and they're saying they can't. There's not a whole lot on this guy per se that he's been in trouble or he was a bad soldier, as you're starting to see. So he's going to go to a court-martial of his peers, and I think Colonel Jacobs brings up some concepts that we'll find in the 15-6. Where was the chain of command? Was there alcohol involved in these things? But I think the larger question is what caused him to snap. We haven't seen an American soldier or Marine do something like this. We've had situations in Haditha, per se, where our troops were under fire and they responded, but this guy sort of went out and found the violence. So he will be tried by a court-martial of his peers, and there's a tremendous amount of sympathy from people like me that say, hey, what's this guy's background? Was he wounded before? Was his friends, were they blown up? But this is so different because he actually went out and did it, and I just think it doesn't, no matter what his attorneys say, the fact that he left the installation on his own and did this is a terrible fact for him to defend.
Let me ask sort of take on this question that so many of us in the U.S. media, in the U.S. military, as we just heard from Jon, our initial questions are about this soldier. But if you're an Afghan civilian, the idea of someone killing 16 civilians, and then the first question being mental health questions around the soldier who did the killing, rather than what would have likely been the reaction had an Afghan killed 16 Americans. This sense that that person was a terrorist or, was somehow an awful, is there something different based on sort of where we're standing, our assumptions about what kinds of questions to even ask?
Well, I'm a fairly narrow-minded person, so for me, there is no difference. When somebody does something wrong, almost all the time, he knows it's wrong when he did it. And the attempt by the defense to lay the pipes for a defense that says that he was not responsible for his actions, I think, is going to fall. That's all going to fall on deaf ears, because the investigation, in my judgment, is going to demonstrate that there was premeditation, and that all of his problems notwithstanding, that he knew he was doing the wrong thing when he did it. What's really interesting about the response to get back to your question about Afghans, is that there were huge riots in which, 29 or 30 people, Afghans, were killed, many more wounded by the riots after the unintentional burning of Korans no riots over the slaughtering of 16 Afghans, 9 of them innocent children. It tells you a great deal about what our relationship is with the Afghans and really what our lack of understanding is about that culture.
Yeah, speaking of our relationship with them, John, I'm going to come to you in one second, but before I do, I want to show John McCain was on Meet the Press just a few moments ago, and Arizona Senator John McCain had this to say about the situation in Afghanistan. Oh, well, sorry, we don't have that. So, but what Mr. McCain was talking about this morning is this idea that actually we have been doing well, that the relationship is progressing, and yet when we look at kind of the timeline since January, a timeline that looks like, you know, again, these initial pictures of soldiers urinating, and then the pictures or the stories around whether the burning of the Korans was intentional or unintentional, and now this. Are we in a situation where, in fact, this is beginning to fall apart, where we don't have, in fact, the kinds of hearts and minds relationships that is exactly what is meant to be our withdrawal strategy?
Well, I think the major point here, and I talked about this a lot when I wrote those pieces this week at the Huffington Post, is the counterinsurgency strategy laid out by the President of the United States 2 years ago. It was a failing strategy from the start because there was a timeline on it. So when you want to do a counterinsurgency strategy, it's dependent upon a couple things. One is how we behave, and I'm very much in agreement with Colonel Jacobs. I mean, I went to the Counterinsurgency Academy last year at Fort Polk prior to going to Iraq. They train Afghan advisors and Iraqi advisors together. We know to shoot less, not more. We know these things aren't the right way to go because it undermines our credibility with the indigenous government. But you can't put all these troops out in the field, out in these villages, to provide security, where they're actually out there with Afghan forces, controlling terrain. And then we have another element of the mission that trains up the Afghan military. Then we embed them with U.S. forces. We never had the time to complete that mission under the guidance of what at the time General Petraeus and General McChrystal and the President of the United States laid out. So that mission can never work. Senator McCain is just wedded to a bad, failed policy. And so if President Karzai doesn't have the political credibility to allow us to stay out in those villages, it defeats the purpose, because our mission on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan is very simple with counterinsurgency. We are supporting the democratically elected government in their ability to gain control of the countryside in the areas where the insurgents work, so we can broker a leveraged response. And this cannot happen if President Karzai doesn't support it. So basically, the president has to adjust our mission.
You know, this is very interesting. President Obama was actually just asked about the conditions in Afghanistan during a joint press conference with Prime Minister David Cameron, British Prime Minister David Cameron, and this is what he had to say about it.
On the general Afghan question, why do you think it is that people feel that you talk a good game, but they don't buy it?
It's because we've been there for 10 years, and people get weary, and they know friends and neighbors who have lost loved ones as a consequence of war. No one wants war.
No one wants war, and we are war weary. When you hear the president using that language of war weariness, when you hear Jon Soltz talking about sort of the connection to a failed strategy, is that what is happening with our soldiers, with their families, and quite honestly, undoubtedly, with the Afghan people, who must also be war weary after all this time?
Well, I think that's right. I think there is a lot of war weariness. Our civilian population is weary of this war as well. And going back to what we've been talking about this particular soldier, he may very well have known that what he was doing was wrong, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't affected by what's happened to him over, this was the 4th tour. There may have been some injuries along the way. Apparently, reports indicate that there was something that was very traumatic that he was part of earlier that day, witnessing another soldier lose a leg. So we have to separate out. There are two issues here. One is what happens to men and women in war. This is not what they all typically do.
Right.
But these things can lead to an irrational act in someone who is prone or vulnerable. And to the Colonel's point, you know, the chain of command, often when we look back, there were signs. We'll know that as this comes out.
We're going to take a break now. We're going to come back, and I want to talk more about this question of war weariness and how that actually impacts our ability to address the issue of instability in Afghanistan and U.S.-Afghani relations. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are discussing the instability in Afghanistan, which is causing a rift in U.S.-Afghani relations. Part and parcel of the U.S. exit strategy is crafting a political resolution between the Taliban and the Afghan government. So on Thursday, Taliban forces in Afghanistan called off reconciliation talks with U.S. officials, accusing the U.S. of changing the parameters of the compromise. The Obama administration has made it clear that U.S. troop drawdown in Afghanistan requires political stability. So to help us navigate this rocky terrain is retired Colonel Jack Jacobs, who is our MSNBC military analyst, Barbara Van de Ven, a clinical psychologist, and Jon Soltz, an Iraq war veteran. I want to kind of pick up where we left off, and I want to start with Leon Panetta, who on Wednesday basically made a statement about the war in Afghanistan and just about war in general. So let's take a listen.
War is hell, and these kinds of events take place in war. We see the mistakes that are made. We see the kind of incidents that took place like this. We've experienced them in past wars, and we're obviously experiencing them in this war. But in the end, it can't undermine the main mission we're about and the strategy we've put in place, because I think it's the right strategy.
So, Colonel, war is hell. It's possible that traumatic things happened to this soldier in the moments or the days or even the years before this incident. But I know you have some reservations about using this sort of war is hell as a way of explaining an incident like this.
Well, Barbara and I were talking about it during the break. War is hell. It's a terrible business. But we can't fall into the trap of saying that because war is so difficult and people suffer from it, those who are fighting suffer from it, that it excuses reprehensible behavior. That this guy was on his 4th tour. I know people on their 11th tours who don't go around murdering people. And yet there are plenty of murderers in jail and in the ground who never wore a uniform. So war is certainly a terrible thing. As John Stuart Mill said, it's not the worst of things, but it is a terrible thing. But we can't fall into the trap of excusing reprehensible behavior just because somebody had a traumatic I had a traumatic brain injury, and no matter what my friends and neighbors say, there's nothing particularly wrong with me. So we have to be very, very careful about cause and effect.
John, I want to go to you also on this question of how then an act like this impacts the ability of these nations to move forward. I mean, does this sort of single act begin to disrail whatever movement we had towards our drawdown and brokering some kind of agreement with Taliban and Afghan officials?
Yeah, the Taliban's pouring it on. I mean, it's not that we broke any rules here. We've lost a lot of leverage. The counterinsurgency strategy laid out by the president, it's a hard strategy to execute because everyone has to do the right thing. So, for instance, in 2003 when I was in Baghdad, hey, we'd suppress, let's say an AK-47 from the top of a building with a 50 cal. We'd knock that building down. We try not to do things like that now because every time if someone gets killed who isn't the guy shooting at you, it hurts the American perception in the population. And so when you have burning of Qurans, Marines urinating on soldiers, and now obviously a staff sergeant in the United States Army leaving an installation and killing women and children at night. These are things overall that undermine the president's counterinsurgency plan. And the reason it's a problem is very similar to the immunity question at the very end of the Iraq War, of whether or not Prime Minister Maliki would do the extension. He wanted to do the extension, but his political coalition wouldn't allow him to do it without U.S. soldiers having diplomatic immunity, which means they could be tried in Iraqi courts. Very similar things are going to happen in the dynamic in Afghanistan. We are there supporting President Karzai. He is saying U.S. forces aren't an occupying force. They're there to help the population. So when we behave in this capacity, it undermines his political credibility, and he reacts to that like he has in the last week. So a large question for him is, can he politically sustain U.S. forces in this strategy? Can he politically sustain a counter-terror plan that we kind of always needed there, which is the ability to do the missions like we did against bin Laden?
Absolutely. And so let's actually take a moment and actually listen to President Karzai, who's the Afghanistan president, on exactly this question.
The Afghan investigation team did not receive the cooperation that they expected from the United States. Therefore, these are all questions that we'll be raising, and raising very loudly and raising very clearly. This has been going on for too long. You have heard me before. Therefore, it is by all means the end of the rope here.
The end of the rope. So we have